My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another episode of Cashcroft TV, Ancient History. Today we'll be doing Pericles and Fabius from ancient Greece and Rome, respectively. I put up this PowerPoint deck. I hadn't done this previously, but I thought it'd be something nice to look at rather than my face the whole time. So, yeah, hope you enjoy it. So we'll start with Pericles from ancient Athens. So he was born in 495 BC and he died in 429 BC. He had powerful parents on both sides, so not like some of our previous heroes or who had came from nothing. He definitely had wealthy and powerful parents. His mother, when she was pregnant prior to his birth, she had a vision that she would give birth to a lion. It's kind of similar to Alexander the Great's origin story. They found a similar thing about in that case. However, some attribute this also to his Pericles was known for having a big head because he always wore this big helmet. Here, I'll show you. See, he always wore this big helmet, and he's pretty famous for that. They called him Squill Head. Squill is a sea onion, so it's once again a reference to his big head. And I don't think he was particularly known for his beauty or anything like that, like some of the other people we've discussed or will discuss. Growing up, he was very introverted and studious, which is strange because he ends up being a very great orator, which is so strange that he grew up not speaking so much. He was gifted with the best education at the time because of his parents' status. His musical teacher was Damon, who was a very famous musical guy back then, and he had philosophers teaching him such as Protagoras, Zeno, and Anaxagoras. So those are very famous philosophers at the time. So his rise to power, he kind of, unlike Fabius, who we'll discuss later, came with quite a boom. He launched this big play, The Persians of Aeschylus, at the biggest theater at the time. And this was a very extravagant representation of his wealth, and some say it demonstrated his partiality towards Themistocles, who we talked about in the last episode. I think Themistocles was his idol because they both had similar philosophies regarding democracy and the investment in their naval capacities of ancient Greece or ancient Athens. So he kind of starts off by ostracizing one of Themistocles' old rivals, Cimon, who was pro the wealthy, and eventually, because Pericles is such a good orator, he manages to get Cimon ostracized by claiming that he was helping Sparta and neglecting Macedon, which was a key interest to Athens. So with Cimon out of the way, he becomes the most powerful man in Athens. Although he was an archon and he was promoting a lot of democracy, he was, in all intensive purposes, nearly not a dictator, but he was definitely a populist leader. So some of the policies that he implemented were he made it so all the poor people could go to the theater for free. And he subsidized this through extravagant taxation on the people, on the wealthy. He once again lowered the cost of archonship, similar to that which Themistocles did. He added higher wages for citizens serving in the jury. So this was just a way to try to get the lower class people more involved in politics at the time. And one thing that he did do was he made it so only people where both of their parents were Athenians could be considered Athenian citizens. This was kind of a strange policy, but he, besides his first and second wife, he also had many lovers from outside of Athens, and I guess this was kind of a way for him to allow him to do this. He was criticized greatly. Some say he was too democratic in the sense that he was taking too much power away from the wealthy. But once Cimon comes back, he starts to accept Pericles' changes, perhaps just because he was so populist and he wouldn't be able to sustain his career if he were not to work with him. So yeah, then the First Peloponnesian War breaks out, which the Peloponnesian War was between essentially Athens and Sparta and their respective allies. Pericles is said to have kind of initiated the war by sort of messing around and with Spartans and starting a little micro battles, but nonetheless, Cimon tries to advocate for peace. He advocates for a 5-year peace treaty, and ultimately he is given much more of the battle control. Cimon, Pericles' rival. Perhaps that's because he was the better military leader, or for various reasons it's disputed, but ultimately Pericles gives himself 9 trophies. However, Plutarch says there was only really one battle in his lifetime where he actually really deserved the full credit. Either way, he was very tough on the allies of the Athenians who supported them in the battle. They forced them to have the same currency, the Athenian currency. However, all minting surpluses went to his secret fund, and anyone who contested the uses of the secret fund would be killed. But with the secret fund, he managed to finance the creation of the Acropolis, which we have an image of here, which still exists today if you go to Greece. It's in pretty much the center of the town, and on top of it is the Parthenon, or the Pantheon, sorry. The Parthenon is in Rome, but the Pantheon is on the top. It's really cool. If you ever go there, you can see the whole city. It looks like it goes on forever. Yeah, it's really cool. So then essentially the second Peloponnesian War eventually breaks out, and once again this is Pericles' fault. He puts a trade embargo on one of the Spartans' allies, which is violated their 30-year peace treaty. Sparta goes to Athens to try to placate this issue. They ask for Pericles to be removed from Spartan land, and they ask for the embargo to be lifted. But Pericles pretty much has no intention of doing this. He gives a counter offer that basically Sparta break itself up and not have their people removed from Spartan land. So it's pretty much he wanted the war to happen. But yeah, he ends up dying only about 2.5 years into the war. So he doesn't really get to see it through fruition, but either way, he wasn't necessarily the best leader, but he definitely was very pro-war. He was always advocating for starting it. Thucydides, who is one of his rivals, not the Thucydides who is the philosopher or historian, but one of his rivals, and I guess it kind of sums up Pericles. He was asked by a Spartan, who is the better fighter, you or Pericles? And he responded almost instantaneously that Pericles is the better fighter because even in defeat, he would convince the audience that he was the winner. So it's kind of a cool anecdote to prove that oratory skills or winning the population could almost be more important than winning the war or good policy. Yeah, so we'll get into a bit more of him in the comparison at the end. So Fabius is, I would say, quite fabulous. That's not, yeah, either way. He was very great war guy. He was born from a powerful family, similar to Pericles. His cogname, in ancient Rome, they had like 3 names, and the cogname was the one that differentiated them from the family. So it's kind of like a first name we have here in Western culture. But his third name was Verruculus, which meant like warty, because he had like warts on his face. So kind of like, I forgot to change the slide, so I'm new to this. So kind of like Pericles, he was not particularly attractive. And also in his youth, he was also neither a good athlete, he was considered a slow speaker, but later they attributed that to his prudence and careful judgment. But nonetheless, unlike Pericles, who came into power through very, very quickly, he slowly and steadily rose to power through occasionally winning wars, well, always winning wars, and just showing his skills throughout the people and never being too showy. Eventually, this war breaks out, the Punic War. Well, it's thought that he never really involved in the first Punic War, but the second Punic War, which is against Carthage, breaks out, and that Carthage is led by the famous leader Hannibal, who deserves a video on his own for, yeah, he's just one of the greatest military strategists of all time. But Rome was in a very poor state at the time, and Pericles gets the title of contractor, which means like sort of hesitant or one who waits to strike. And in some ways, well, he is considered the founder of guerrilla warfare. So what he did with Hannibal was he knew he could not beat Hannibal face to face because Carthage was a much bigger military force at the time, but they would win through small battles. And another thing that they sort of kind of invented was the burning of fields and resources, so that when Hannibal were to try to chase them, they would not be able to sustain their armies. This was kind of copied in Russia when Napoleon invaded Russia, and also in World War II when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. It's also seen in many other times in history, but it's an important tactic and was sort of invented by Fabius. Yeah, so eventually he exhausted him. I guess the most famous story about him was he was a very religious guy, and he claimed a lot of their failures was that they did not do enough sacrifices. So one time he returned to Rome to do a sacrifice, and he left the army with Minicus, who thought that Fabius was too shy in battle, and that was the reason for their failure. And at this time, his strategy had not been proven, and the conctator title was sort of an insult. And Minicus charged straight into battle, winning a small victory, and sort of made a fool of Fabius, who was at the time dictator. But Fabius was certain that he would eventually prove his prudence in war, so they decide that they split the army into two, and he sort of waits it out for Minicus to make a mistake. So within very short period of time, Minicus charges at Hannibal and starts to win, and everyone thinks he's doing a great job, but Hannibal, obviously, because Hannibal is a great leader, has a trap set up, and he quickly starts losing. But Fabius, who is humble in defeat, goes and saves them, and all of Rome starts to love him and sort of vindicates his strategy. And yeah, eventually the battle with Hannibal continues on. He never ends up being able to defeat Hannibal, but he sort of coined a strategy that was effective not only in this war, but the Second Punic War, but throughout wars in future history. Eventually, he is no longer a dictator, and they go back to their old ways. Varro, one of the leaders at the time, starts a war tries fighting Hannibal head on, and the Romans get absolutely massacred. And Fabius demonstrates his leadership abilities by placating the people. He understands that the people need to grieve because so many people are dead, but he restricts grieving to indoors and only during select times. And he says that after the 1 month of mourning, that they just finish it and kind of get over it. And that's kind of a good lesson for, just getting over tragedy. And he showed a great deal of leadership in that capacity. Yeah, eventually this other great leader, Scipio Africanus, who is kind of like Minicus and he wants to battle him straight on, starts rising in Rome. And this is already after Fabius is old and retired, but he argues against Scipio quite aggressively. Scipio ends up proving to be right, and he later is the one who defeats Hannibal, but he kind of argues for his ideology till the day he dies. Sort of like Pericles, he dies of sickness. Pericles died of the plague. He died of illness, and but he died in great favor amongst the Romans and great favor throughout history. There's like Fabian warfare is a whole sector of warfare. Guerrilla warfare is largely his warfare. The concept of burning down resources after getting defeated is also his strategy. George Washington was referred to as the American Fabius, which is quite a compliment to both great leaders. So I guess for comparisons, similarities, they were both, actually contrast first. They were both, contrast. Pericles was a great orator, whereas Fabius was very shy, very quiet, and had really none of that. Pericles, at the time, his state was in a much better position. That was the golden years of Athens, whereas Fabius was ruling in a time where things were not going well for Rome. They were getting up against probably the greatest, or one of the greatest opponents they ever face, even in Republican times and the times of emperor. They became an empire. But Plutarch is quick to note that it is not necessarily harder to be in a tough state. It's almost more difficult to win over a state that's in a good position. I guess you could see that in a lot of first world countries, even though they are at, in many cases, the best economic state they've ever been in history, or the best financial state, the best quality of living. They are very tough on politicians and very tough to please. So in that respect, he sort of defends Pericles there. In terms of opponent, there's no doubt that Hannibal was a much more challenging opponent than the Spartans. For Pericles, he was sort of taking advantage. The Athenians were stronger and more powerful than their opponent, the Spartans. Hence the reason why they tended to win. Whereas for Fabius, Hannibal was the better opponent. His army was much larger, and he managed to hold on. And as mentioned earlier, many of the war victories could not really be attributed to Pericles. Some of them were the result of Cimon or Thucydides, whereas Fabius is not only accountable for his own victories, but even those of other generals, such as Minicus, who he saved. In terms of similarities, I guess they were both ugly. I guess that's kind of uncommon for leaders. They tend to be beautiful, well, not beautiful. They tend to be more charismatic looking. These guys, one was known as the warty guy, and the other guy is big-headed, which is not necessarily bad, but they were insulted a lot by the public. And they were both somewhat more humble financially. They both, Pericles offered to pay all of his money to build the Parthenon and whatnot, and Fabius would pay ransom for Romans out of his own pocket, and neither of them, although they did strive for respect of the people, neither of them strive for personal gain. Maybe more so Fabius than Pericles, but yeah, so that's Pericles and Fabius. I hope you enjoyed. Next video on Alcibiades and Coriolanus should be very good. I think they're very interesting people and really quite different from any other leader in history, because they are both traitors. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you watch the next video. Thanks so much.